Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, for including me in the program for this week, and for excusing my lack of Kant in this paper. But there's a bit of time. So I'd like to begin my talk today with a short poem by Mina Loy titled Gertrude Stein. Curie of the laboratory of vocabulary, she crushed the tonnage of consciousness congealed to phrases to extract a radium of the word. Radium, a radioactive metal, is highly reactive. Forms hydroxides, it's a negatively charged ion, very active. It's a dangerous substance, luminescent and threatening. Yet, in this poem, there is a sense that this threat is well underhand, and that Stein, figured here as Marie Curie, who discovered radium only 3 years before Stein published her provocative collection, Tender Buttons, has managed to neutralize the danger enough to perform a sort of extraction. Here, Loy figures consciousness as heavy and material, something that can be solidified and then crushed to uncover a fundamental element of the word of language. Intention here, then, is an extractive process, and the core reactive property of the word, figured here as explicitly material and elemental, exists beyond active conscious experience. Craig Dworkin, who takes the title of his volume on the poetics of materiality from this poem, suggests the following. If the materiality of the signifier attracts other words, metonymically as related things, in addition to the associations made by the related concepts of what linguistic signs signify, the converse holds as well. Objects attract the signs associated with them. Thus, there is a bidirectional extension of meaning here. Perhaps the conscious critical act may enliven or extract meaning from language, but associative structures of significance maintain an essential, material, irreducible dimension. So, following Chris Nealon's recent claim that poetry is the scene of a perpetual making that never quite settles into a state of having been made, I want to suggest that a poetics oriented toward the issue of materiality of language, the question of whether a word is a thing or can function as a meaningful representation of a thing, I did not finish that sentence there. Anyways, the sense of the ongoing experiment, the creation of new substances from raw and processed materials, and alongside those, scraps and wasted materials guides my talk today. So I will first offer a reading of one of Stein's tender objects before turning to a discussion of recent scholarship on poetic form. After this, I will explore the concept of plastic as form through a reading of A.R. Ammon's Garbage, before turning backwards to consider plastic itself as a structure in Evelyn Riley's poem Styrofoam. I think that my comments pair nicely with Antonia's reading yesterday about alteration and provocation, of the positive risk of creating a shared symbolic disorder. So the opening section of Tender Buttons is this, I'm sure many people here have read it. It's an excavation of objects that mobilizes nouns, crystallizes verbs as though it is a cross-section where difference becomes a quality of sameness and depreciation becomes a form of vibrant transformation. Atmosphere, I feel, dominates Tender Buttons, and it emerges from visual revelation or inclination or indications of textures, of touch, but also of tricks in the light. In her essay, Poetry and Grammar, Stein states that her work in Tender Buttons is doing nothing but using, losing, refusing, and pleasing and betraying and caressing nouns. All of these tactile, intimate verbs. While she does not explicitly figure her poetic project with attenuations of extraction, these are verbs of exchange, of value, of figuring intimacy, and the fear of potential loss. Tender Buttons is a place of effective arrangements that's dynamized by an interplay between aesthetic and social encounters within the home. And there's a sense of offness in the collection that emerges from this decontextualization that's operating at multiple levels. This kind of goes beyond the making strange of the domestic item. Attributes of the objects themselves have sorts of personalities and can inflect moods, and her poetics here often uncover interactive circumstances which may lead to a particular shade of feeling, that may emerge from the dissociated speaker viewing the object, but also may come directly from what is emanating from the object itself. So objects, the poem that I am focusing on for this portion of my talk, develops a sort of tactile epistemology that engages with the trace of the arm, the slender joint, the elbow. But there is an absence of a hand, the absence of a generative creative impulse, and this foregrounds the dominance of her language of contours, of dimensional understanding, and reorients this to a direct reception of the object. So I'll read it. Within, the cut and slender joint alone, with sudden equals and more than three, two in the center make two one side. If the elbow is long and it is filled, so then the best example is altogether, the kind of show made by squeezing. Perception is both accelerated and accumulated here, as the dissociated speaker comes to a conclusion that emphasizes the spatial bloating of the objects. This does something very strange with time. It quickens it crystallizes it. And in the case of objects, the consumptive act here, this is very sort of like meaty eating type language, is ignited by the language of the cut and slender joint and of the show made by squeezing, like how you tell if a steak is done. This rendering of objects in general is taken out of time and placed firmly in a moment of touching, of perceiving, reorienting how space is understood in terms of length, angles, and the desire to understand the withheld inner workings of the object that can only be understood through a touch, through a squeeze. The immediacy of synthesis here is striking, as three becomes two, becomes one, elongating the body and the embodied presence of the indeterminate objects. Poetry about objects often bear the trace of industrialization, particularly in American poetry, of mass production in some respects, but the forms that bracket and frame these objects is also in tension with these systems of efficiency and organization that produce these objects. A turn to new forms, in this case, the syntactically driven, perceptually inflected vignette, or instead of a turn to new forms, perhaps a new view on old forms, could be read as a response to changes in circulation of materials, distribution, political agency, ideas, objects, and imagination. I'm interested in how a new system of poetic order emerges from an obsession with objects, order, and efficiency. Christopher Schmidt, in his work on Poetics and Waste, notes that there is dominant transfiction with rising forms of commodity capitalism, as well as a growing discomfort with underlying Taylorist ideologies of modernist innovation and technology present in Stein's Poetics. So her embrace of what he terms devalued kitsch and mass cultural forms cannot be fully disentangled from her play with genre, language, meaning. So that is her play with the plasticity or the perpetual moldability, flexibility of the noun, the adjective, the shade of feeling in a line of poetry is tied to commodity capitalism. Stein's forms here, the form of the object poem, the long sentence, the ungrammatical or extra-grammatical sentence, the vignette, have histories both within and outside of a literary and aesthetic canon. And Caroline Levine, who recently wrote a very interesting monograph on form, writes that no forms spring up anew in response to particular social facts, but instead hang around available for reuse. In this sense, forms are not outgrowths of social conditions. They do not belong to certain times and places. While Stein's attention may have been increasingly turned towards the proliferation of commodity capitalism or the flexibility of the noun to signify something beyond itself, her engagement with an object form is not exclusively bound to the early 1910s. So this is a form that has existed and will exist. People are still writing about objects. As she writes in her essay, in her lecture, Composition as Explanation, the time of composition is a natural thing, And the time in the composition is a natural thing, it is a natural thing, and it is a contemporary thing. The time of the composition is the time of the composition. So she really inscribes this idea of immediate presence, or the reinscription of the now, a shifting adverb, into both the composition of the poem, but also into the reading experience, which emphasizes a sort of continuity in experiential engagement with both objects and poems. The poem, insofar as it may be read again and again, it is never fully made and will never find itself complete. I wanted to begin with a reading of this poem to introduce the discussion about created objects that is attentive both to the rhetorical rendering of material compositions, but also to subjective engagement with those things. I find the atmosphere of especially the first section of Tender Buttons to be difficult to parse, kind of irreducible, these qualities that emerge from texture, how the inside of these objects seems to be hiding some sort of mystery. It's very immersive. Her treatment of the object, her acceleration of attention, and her emphasis on the commonplace and the disposable imbues Tender Buttons with a sort of sense of delightful instability, an instability that I find that A.R. Ammons and Evelyn Riley deploy in their own poetic projects. And this signals to the precarity of attaching oneself to an object which has a permanence or an impermanence that differs from our own. That is, what an object is, how it feels, how it looks, has to do with how we attend to the object. So our relationship with the production or acquisition of things is bound up intimately with our physical engagement with that thing itself. These discrete poems, these units of strange prose, these renderings of pieces of objects that cannot be fully broken apart, remain attached to some sort of whole, tied formally and phenomenally to conditions of their production and the circumstances of their use and subsequent wastage. Now that we have sorted out the contours of what it is to attend to, respond to, caress, and lose a single tender object, I'd like to suggest that we consider what happens when we turn our gaze from the dominance of a single object on the imagination to the dominance of many. Where are the seams of a system that produces an insurmountable amount of waste evident and legible? What totality is revealed? And this movement, this change in atmosphere between the one and the many happens, to some respect in time, but also out of time, as I will get into. All right, so in his study on waste and poetics, Christopher Schmidt proposes the following. He's writing here about waste, sort of accommodating for his choice of the word waste as opposed to trash, garbage, junk, etc. So he writes, "There is something euphemistic and even bureaucratic about the word. If waste is a euphemism covering over an entire category of materials too unsavory to identify, it is also metaphorically capacious, encompassing categories of garbage, shit, sexual excess, economic surplus, unproductive labor, idleness, and aesthetic imbalance. When used within a more strictly material sense, waste cleaves together two obverse categories of matter: organic waste, often excrement, which might be said to be pre-objectal, and industrial waste, discards, obsolete commodities, pollution, etc., which might be termed post-objectal." So this reading of the waste object, or waste in general, locates it on a continuum, a trajectory that mirrors the process of existence. So there's a gestational period, a life, and then an afterlife. So the beginning and the end of the life of the obsolete commodity specifically exists because of, and also in spite of, cycles of life. What is made and wasted cannot be reincorporated, so the life cycle of the object is not self-enclosed, not a total whole, and perpetuates the existence of a system which relies on its ultimate exclusion. While with Stein, we took a look at the objects in a state of perpetual availability, in a contemporary moment of presence, of the continual reemergence of materiality through the reading process, of the available inscription of the object, I would like to turn to other forms of matter, or rather, in terms that I will entangle in a moment, other affordances of matter in poetics. As plastic itself can occupy all three of these categories that Schmidt introduces, the pre, post, and I guess the immediately present objectal, it is a useful symbol or medium through which to think through the form of the object poem. So before I move into an explicit discussion of form and its relation to waste and garbage as I see it, I'd like to clarify some terminology. So here I follow Schmidt's definition of waste as a euphemism for organic traces of the body or traces of unwanted productions, and also John Scanlon's definition of garbage from his monograph on garbage, leftover useless matter, which potentially has more inorganic constructed connotations than waste. Both of these definitions have rich networks of meaning, and both reference to what is thrust outside of a particular system, a disruption that extends beyond the waste objects or garbage's phenomenal appearance as matter. While in Schmidt's work, he emphasizes that waste and its implied disruptions lead it to be the more abstract of the two terms and therefore the more theoretically rich, I want to suggest that garbage cannot be thought of as primarily concrete either, given its own semantic flexibility as a term. So now time to talk about form. So perhaps in terms too simple, form refers to the shape of things. In poetry, of the container that holds together poetic imaginaries. I'm thinking of the sonnet, the sestina, forms with strict structural rules that allow for a degree of certain semantic creativity within those bounds. However, recent critical discussions of form, including this text by Schmidt and Christopher Nealon, who I mentioned earlier, as well as Caroline Levine and Devin Griffiths, they're all interested in how forms emerge from and are, in some respects, co-constitutive of what Schmidt calls aesthetic economies that are underpinned and constructed by ideologies of consumerism. To consider form beyond aesthetics and to bring in sociological concerns into the discussion, I think is a productive re-situation of the dynamism of poetic form and also a productive way to think about waste. So this reading of form's relationship to broader ideological structures aligns with what Devin Griffiths' recent claim in Critical Inquiry that poetic form necessarily has material, phenomenal, and flexible dimensions. He proposes a plastic understanding of poetic form, saying that form is inherent in the constitution of natural and social systems and interactions. And he suggests that form cannot be read as organizing principles proper that are prescribed by particular perceptive or linguistic impulses, but rather form is recognized and recapitulated through attention to organic and anatomic as well as social and cultural arrangements. He writes the following, proposing a turn away from understanding form as a container. Rather than the discrete combination of shape and substance, form is a constellation of things and repeated actions. More precisely, any form is a sequence of events that happens at the interface between multiple things, the mold, the behavior of its alternating contents, the air and its atmospheric pressure, and so on. The simple distinction between form and content does not adequately capture the dynamic and expanded nature of these relations. In place of moldy formalism, and instead of container form, we need a relational formalism and a theory of reform. To put this differently, form is ecological. It works through wider networks of relation and of the material, energetic, and social interactions that give it life. While I do not want to suggest that we do away with the idea of stability of form within an individual poem or the history of formalism and structure in poetry, indeed these are important lineages, especially in literary criticism, I do appreciate the opening of the field for formal analysis that Griffiths suggests. I'm interested in the idea that to read for form is not to read for ideals. So while form may feel transcendent, it retains a sort of empirical bent in this view. His central provocation in the article is thus: how does a form take form? Form, particularly poetic form in 20th and 21st century American poems about objects and waste, is inflected by questions of ecological extraction, use, and labor. So I'd like to return for a moment to Carolyn Levine. She suggests that to reinterpret how form takes form, she writes that the orders that we ourselves impose, our spatial and temporal arrangements, our hierarchies of values and distributions of wealth, all constitute different sorts of forms, including literary forms. So she suggests that form is always intimately bound up with questions of use and utility. She draws on the design concept of affordance to express the practical and material dimensions of a formalist critique. So this not only underscores the phenomenal appearance of an object, let's say this bottle of water, but emphasizes what this object is able to do, or how a subject or an agent might use that object. I am going to use it to drink from actually right now. So a form in this schematic is iterative, portable, and plastic. It's capable of redetermination and recontextualization. And as she writes, form and materiality are inextricable, but materiality is determinant. So her definition of form as being all shapes and configurations, all ordering principles, all patterns of repetition and difference, resonates with Lynn Hegenian's commentary on form in The Rejection of Closure. So if we must understand form as a container, it is one with plasticity, the ability to rework or iterate itself in terms of the threat of implicit destruction, of excess, of leakage. So I'll turn to Hegenian now. The relationship of form, or the constructive principle, to the materials of the work, to its themes, conceptual mass, but also to the words themselves, is the initial problem for the open text, one that faces each writing anew. Can form make the primary chaos, the raw material, the unorganized impulse and information, the uncertainty, incompleteness, vastness, articulate without depriving it of its capacious vitality, its generative power? Can form go even further than that and actually generate that potency, opening uncertainty to curiosity, incompleteness to speculation, and turning vastness into plenitude? In my opinion, the answer is yes. That is, in fact, the function of form in art. Form is not a fixture, but an activity. So form is imaginative insofar as it is sort of a multi-dimensional production that can be experienced in and over time, in and through space. And in this way, form takes on a sort of circulatory dimension. So my interest is not to explain the question of form away through focusing on material conditions of creation or getting rid of form in general, but rather I would like to read context through formal considerations. I follow Levine's methodological procedure to remain attuned to the overlap of multiple forms at play without cultivating an explicit hierarchy of meaning in analysis and without assumptions about textual and literary function. I would also like to suggest that attention is at the center of considerations of form and affordances. Form mediates the representation between presence of words on the page and organizational principles of social and historical networks. To think of plastic's relationship to form, or forming, or formation, like to think plastic itself is kind of to remove the task of formation from our view entirely. The life of the polymer begins outside of meaningful human time, deep in the earth, and it seems as though everything that has to do with the creation of plastic products happens elsewhere. Petroleum lays earnestly in wait. Extraction often happens elsewhere. The life of a polymer begins as a waste object in itself. It's made from what they can't actually use oil for. Polymeric structures were devised in labs, also closed spaces, and plastic objects are produced within certain spatial boundaries as well. So we can't actually see the genesis or the pre-objectal form of plastic. And it's interesting that plastic, it begins as a waste product in itself, an organic waste product, and it's offered a second life through the production of plastics. But the second life is kind of a false start given the current ephemerality of much of the world's plastics. As it is a key component in packaging, it's meant to be used and discarded. Just very quickly, these are images from this fantastic documentary about Sable Island in Nova Scotia. It's a sandbar with a lot of feral horses. Fantastic documentary. There's a woman who lives on this island, and all of this garbage washes up on the shore. All of these bits of balloons and these bottles, and she collects them, and she washes them, and she categorizes them, and she has bottles from all over the world, like birthday balloons from Indiana. It's crazy, the traces of that. Just wanted to explain the image. So the emergence of inorganic waste and waste disposal in America has roots in the 20th century, and in the interest of time, I will not go into depth on that history. But what I will say is that waste management, garbage disposal, emerges as at a moment in which the cycles of production and consumption can no longer incorporate these materials back into themselves. The cycle continues insofar as waste is removed from these structures, so to speak, and the disposal industry emerges to remove things, useless things from this system, to direct attention away from the insurmountable accumulation of trash. So on garbage, a collection I mentioned, or a monograph I mentioned earlier, John Scanlon argues that essentially garbage is a very powerful, it has a lot of metaphorical heft because of the strange status of the piece of garbage as both something and nothing. We have no use for it, it's left over, it's often been removed from view, but it cannot be considered nothing. It is not a literal or conceptual void, and it is rather something else entirely. So he writes, if we recall that garbage arrives at its fate because it either suffers or affects some disconnection, it is the separation of a part from a greater whole, we can see in the symbols of disorder the guiding power of garbage too. On the one hand, enforce the separation of the part from the whole, whilst at the same time rehearsing the steps that led to the banishment of garbage. So there is a cycle occurring right here. It's just not a cycle of reincorporation, but of recapitulation. It is a cycle dependent on expulsion in order to propel itself forward. The cultivation, I'm going to switch gears a little in the interest of time. The cultivation of an intentional poetic space that mediates multiple genealogies of form or discordant readings of particular thematic registers complicates the reception of the word waste, of the word garbage, of the word plastic. The collision between the form of poetry and the form of waste elides both the impulse to celebrate plastic and capitalism as vibrant innovations, as well as the inclination to completely disentangle ourselves from plastic and resource extraction entirely, something that I do think, unfortunately, is unimaginable. Plastic keeps people alive. So to poeticize waste, I want to suggest, is to engage in making use of scraps and detritus, and this can catalyze the potentiality of waste and open the literary field for intervention or resuscitation. To think of creation alongside wasting is to avoid the trappings of miring oneself too deeply in the pitfalls of presuming loss in a toxic culture. So I'd like to briefly reframe Griffith's central provocation in the ecology of form. How does waste take form? What's more, how does plastic, as a restructured waste product that transforms into a waste object, influence a contemporary understanding of the relationship between form and matter? How are waste objects contextualized or recontextualized? So plastic, a fairly recent chemical innovation, is conceptually and literally bound up with ideas of recurrence, availability, immediate obsolescence. Plastic is also often an afterthought, a synthetic object which enables the perpetual consumption and delivery of other commodities. So while plastic has this interesting position of being both dominant and peripheral, it often accumulates in waste bins, in recycling bins, and because of the emergence of waste management, taking the garbage away of the recycling plant or the landfill, on a personal level, we can really do away with plastic. Motivation to, mobilize against plastic, I feel like it has a moral dimension. We all feel a little peripheral guilt if we dispose of plastic improperly, or, we forget our water bottle at home. We realize that we're not just tossing it away. It will crop up somewhere. It'll choke an albatross, embed itself in the gut of a salmon. It'll inspire strange adverse health impacts in a remote community. But the motivation to politicize plastic in those ways does little in the way of actually advocating for workers, for communities who actually live by these landfills. And plastic matters, certainly, but how does it matter? To whom? And how can we resuscitate our relationship with it without reifying or divorcing ourselves from it? So as Roland Barthes writes, plastic is the very idea of its infinite transformation. As its everyday name indicates, its ubiquity is made visible, and it is this, in fact, which makes it a miraculous substance. Plastic remains impregnated throughout this wonder. It is less a thing than the trace of a movement. Yet, he wrote this many decades ago, and I want to suggest that in some respects it has lost its miraculous quality. We're no longer shocked and excited by it anymore. And also, plastic itself, it doesn't have this incredible plasticity that it should have. It bends until a point of breakage. It becomes warped through contact with different substances and temperatures. But it doesn't meaningfully disintegrate despite its gradual withdrawal from the world of use, and then it remains in this state of perpetual extension in the landfill. So with that in mind, I want to turn to a landfill, specifically a landfill on the I-95. So in terms of staging a collision between the consequences for a plastopoiesis, I'd like to turn to Garbage by A.R. Ammons. So he's a late 20th century American poet, for those of you who are not familiar, who wrote extensively on ecological space and inhabitation, but he's probably best known for his long poem titled Garbage. Garbage is 18 sections of these contained, unrhymed couplets. While Ammons' verse is not necessarily grammatically regular, his structural choice in the series of unrhymed and jammed couplets is characteristic of his verse more generally. I don't want to frame him as an experimental poet, but I will note about his work, as you will see in a moment. He really doesn't like the period. He favors the comma, the colon, the semicolon as punctuation instead. Which I think gives a sense of perpetual interconnection of language and environment that extends beyond the material bounds of the poetic object. There's a sense of continuation between his poetry and the world that I think he wants to cultivate in his work. I also want to think through the strangeness of this regular form in terms of a thematic like Garbage. He is certainly not the first American poet to climb atop a landfill off of a highway to gaze upon the ruin below, but his addition to the garbage canon. Sorry, I just lost my page on my iPad. I'm not an iPad kid, I just got it. Here I am. So he engages on top of the landfill this sort of hypnotic and terrifying atmosphere evoked by heaps of trash. So he engages several forms in this poem. That of the epic or the long poem, the poem of the everyday, and the poem of plastic. And I want to suggest in his unrhymed interconnected couplets, there is the trace of the neat chain of polymers, the polysterenes. There's this degree of interconnection, of regularity, of infinite chains of meaning in his formal strategies of ordering and linking within the poem. So the speaker of the poem is distracted, self-effacing, a bit earnest at times, and he's constantly searching for wisdom amidst the rubble. The beauty of the sanitation worker and a legacy of his own poetic endurance. Early in the poem, he states, "Garbage has to be the poem of our time because garbage is spiritual." Believable enough to get our attention, getting in the way. Thus, garbage, literal garbage, as we learn, is central to his imagination because he thinks that it is the only thing dominant enough to propel himself to having some sort of legacy. When I say himself, I am referring to the speaker. Thus, his ecological sensibility has been kind of muddled by effluence, pollution, by the leakage of the landfill off the highway into surrounding soil and water sources. And natural environments here have been overtaken and constituted by the dump, created by the dump. And garbage has this magnetic, charismatic role in the text, really orienting the speaker's understanding of the spiritual and social world through the medium of waste and structures of the landfill. So here is an excerpt from an early section in the poem. So this passage begins questioning the origin of the human. He understands himself as a person, as a member of a community, to be emergent from nature, from the land. And he rejects any sense that he can be severed from his material presence. The finer configurations that extend outside of his body indicate the porosity of his body or of our bodies as he recognizes himself as recapitulated outside of his body phenomenally. As cultural and material plasticity is deeply entrenched in the body's natural plasticity, Ammons here grapples with the existential dread of being in a toxic world. As synthetic chemicals saturate the bodies of those who inhabit industrial or post-industrial nations, this passage reads both the body and poetry as sites of complex mediation between natural and synthetic gestures. In my last few minutes, I want to turn away from the ordered poetic form that takes disorder as its primary thematic to ideas of regularity, the bonds of the polymer that give rise to more experimental forms of waste poetry in a much more disordered collection. So I will be taking us through Evelyn Riley's aptly named poetry collection Styrofoam, which examines the eponymous object's presence as both a literal and a cultural microfragment. So if garbage mirrored the neat bonds of plastic that are retained when produced objects become garbage, Styrofoam engages the affordances of the polymer when it has been broken down and is no longer regular. The retaining of form within the polymer is what contains this destructive capacity, and this disorder emerges from an excess of order, a chain of production that works too well because of its dependence on the creation and dispersal of waste. Riley's work considers the disordered shore to reference the wasteland, which in some ways still dominates studies of waste and American poetry, even though The text really isn't about garbage in that way. But she's sitting on this shore, beset with material and cultural fragments that have coalesced into something that resembles a ruin in concept, but not necessarily in appearance. More clearly, she questions what to do with the wasted object, the piece of trash, that has taken its role as discard so seriously and severely as to disappear from view, lurking beneath a visual field, yet remains stubbornly and imperceptibly present in oceans, soils, and bodies as microplastics. It remains ambiguous in Riley's collection as to what possibly could be set in order. How do we go on living when we've introduced so many heaps of particulates into the world? To answer this, she turns to a source of sorts, chemical formulations that make up these synthetic objects, to understand the poetic and generative nature of styrofoam itself, a distant and stubborn, sturdy cousin of polymer plastics. So she's interested in the chemical composition of styrofoam. Diagrams like this appear frequently in the collection, and she tries to reconcile the regularity of these internal structures with the irregularity it introduces into environments. So for her, materiality is not predetermined by these chemical formulations, but instead derives that from the complex interactions of actants within a given system. This is she feels like a student of Latour. We are all enmeshed in Riley's world. So in her collection, nature is not necessarily in a state of explicit devolution, but nature's form, through the increased introduction of synthetic interventions, is transforming. There is a destructive potential in this transformation, but it is transformation nonetheless. In the book, she remarks, "It is not the end of the world, just of this particular one." So from this place, her concept of plasticity and indeed experimental poetry, she would say, is one of the plastic arts, also functions as her conception of the essence of language, material and spirit. Yet these essences are boiled down and fleeting, stripped to their basest parts. What is plastic for Riley, I'd like to suggest, is poetic form, remaining flexible and bendable and lively. However malleable and dynamic the collection is, styrofoam does not live up to the latter half of its name. She defines foam early in the collection as a material that can be molded into anything, any shape. However, styrofoam, once it's been molded, cannot be molded again in this way. It holds its shape until it's broken from stress. So we begin in this collection with an image, a rendering of polystyrene, a regular chain of methylenes, and then the first lines of the poem take the form of an incomplete call and response. We receive an answer to an unasked question: styrofoam deathlessness. She follows up with a question: how long does it take? How long does what take? This question could be loaded or not, ironic or sincere. And not only do we meet styrofoam here, but we are introduced to the syntactic ambiguity that runs through the collection. We are introduced to its polymeric cousins, including the compositions of a hat and an ornamental trim, as well as the entrance of ethynyl methyl octahydrocyclopentadiol. So both the hat and the trim are introduced with a single square bracket enclosed, but the bracket is left open, unfinished. There's a sort of everlastingness, a deathlessness here on its own. This formal strategy makes me think a lot of what Ammons does with his commas and his semicolons. And these are the first plastic intrusions of the collection, where an object emerges, it remains unremarked on, and it looms over the rest of the text with the absence of the second bracket. She proposes two ambivalent answers to her question: how long does it take, on the next page. It is a misconception that materials biodegrade in a meaningful time frame, and thought to be composters, landfills are actually vast mummifiers of waste and waste companions. So the deathlessness of styrofoam is akin to a sort of fractured and partial immortality, a half-life unable to fully activate itself in the world, but remaining potent, present, and acutely discomforting. While both answers address an aspect of how long does it take, each takes a step to avoid a clear, fact-derived scientific answer. What constitutes a meaningful time frame? A life, a generation? Is time meaningless to styrofoam? And how is meaning circulating here? The second answer is more ambiguous, adopting a register of preservation as opposed to de- and recomposition, the creation of a plasticized relic, a memorial of the era, or a plastiglomerate. Interestingly, Caroline Levine, in her book on form, excludes formless poetry, or poetry that includes a lot of fissures, breaks, and gaps, from her idea of form and formal analysis. She's done with all that experimentation, and she attempts to grade against recent critical trends to emphasize formlessness or deformation. But I think that poets like A.R. Ammons and Evelyn Riley take up the affordances of the garbage fissure, the break of waste and plastic, to grate against the ideas of whole or enclosed structures, to emphasize the necessity of waste within a system, even if it appears to be excised from said system or structure. Thank you.